Thank you for joining us as we take you back to Iwo Jima for this year's Heritage Night, brought to you by BAE Systems. A longtime supporter of SNA, BAE Systems is a global defense, aerospace, and security company with more than 83,000 employees worldwide. They are committed to providing advanced technology and capabilities to the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps today to win the battles of tomorrow. Their engineering experts have been working side by side with U.S. sailors and Marines to modernize and strengthen the Navy's fleet for over 50 years. BAE Systems is delighted to have the opportunity to help SNA with its mission of preserving and enhancing the heritage of the surface naval forces. So sit back, relax, and listen in as we take you back to Iwo Jima.
Good evening, and welcome to the Surface Navy Association Annual Heritage Evening. My name is Captain Paul Rinn. I am the Awards Committee Chair, and I am the moderator for this evening's panel. I would like to take this opportunity to thank BAE Systems Corporation for the support of this event, which is now in its 23rd year, and is something that has been enjoyed by the members of the Surface Navy Association and other attendees of the symposium during that entire time. Tonight's topic is the Battle of Iwo Jima, 19 February to 26 March 1945. This event has many interesting aspects and influences. And although a signature victory for the Marine Corps, when the casualty figures came in with over 26,000 casualties, it raised the question, was the assault on the island actually necessary? Tonight's presenters will examine these pre-attack bombardment considerations, the important tactical issues, the strategy, the political considerations, tactics, logistics, and naval support, as well as what was learned from the operation and how it affected future Navy, Marine Corps plans for Okinawa and the anticipated invasion of the Japanese homeland. We have three eloquent scholars, historians, who enlighten us and give us their insights and their knowledge. Number one is Dr. Peter Haynes, who is from the Naval Historical and History Command. He is their Samuel Eliot Morrison History Scholar, a retired naval aviator and a warrior, with several combat awards for his carrier experiences, especially while flying from the Carl Vinson during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Our second speaker tonight will be Rear Admiral Sam Cox, the director of the Navy Historical and History Command and the curator of the Navy, and a historian with a reputation for knowing the deepest of facts about many of the most important battles and engagements that the United States Navy has entered into. Lastly, Colonel Douglas Kleinsmith, U.S. Marine Corps, a noted historian of military history and also a combat veteran, who pinpointed calls for fire that blunted the first Iraqi advance during Operation Desert Storm, and who also has the remarkable distinction of being the last forward observer to call in 16-inch gunfire on targets in an operational combat environment. And without any further ado, let me please introduce Dr. Peter Haynes.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Pete Haynes. I'm honored to be part of SNA's Heritage Night, having attended several SNAs in the past, and really privileged, to discuss Iwo Jima. And as a strategic scholar and former strategist, Admiral Ray Spruance, one of my favorite strategists. My job tonight is to introduce the topic of the Battle of Iwo Jima and provide a strategic perspective of Iwo Jima. So I'll answer two questions. First, since Iwo Jima appeared rarely in the 34 years of War Plan Orange, namely because it had no natural harbor or protected anchorage, what changed? Why did Iwo Jima had to have been assaulted? Second, how sound was Spruance's decision to shift U.S. strategy in the last year of the war by advocating to seize Iwo Jima and Okinawa instead of the original plans of Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and the port city of Amoy in China? As Fifth Fleet Commander, Spruance was responsible for planning and executing operations following MacArthur's invasion of Luzon, the northern island of the PI, scheduled for December 1944. This is not history for history's sake. We're currently engaged in a maritime great power competition with China, but it's been 76 years since we waged great power war at sea. We need to understand how the likes of Spruance, Richmond K. Turner, and Lieutenant General Holland Smith, for example, approach the problem of how to project power across the Pacific in the face of fanatical anti-access efforts. These admirals and generals were really the first architects of what we now know as distributed maritime operations, littoral operations in a contested environment, and expeditionary advanced base operations, among others. Here's the iconic photograph of Iwo Jima. As you'll soon find out, criticism of the high costs of the 36-day assault started amid the battle itself, and arguments about the battle's cost-strategic benefit ratio have continued ever since. And for good reason. The costs, as we see, were immense. It was the only offensive in the Pacific where U.S. casualties exceeded the Japanese casualties. And here, U.S. casualties was 26,000, and almost all the 21,000 Japanese ended up dying. I think there was roughly about 200 to 300 POWs or so. Of note, of the 880 Navy personnel that were killed, more than a third were corpsmen. But this group was expansive. Seabees, doctors, SWOs, aviators, you name it. Also a number of firsts. It was obviously the first battle on what is considered the soil of Japan. No other battle saw more medals of honor. Of the 27 medals of honor, 4 went to Navy corpsmen, 2 posthumously, and 1 to the CO of LCIG 449, Lieutenant Rufus Herring, that Director Cox will speak to more directly. The Marines' 22 medals of honor is more than a quarter of the 82 awarded to Marines during the entire war. Numbers, however, really fail to tell the story of Iwo Jima. As Victor Hansen noted, for the American servicemen, the Pacific War was no bad dream. It was a nightmare of unprecedented proportion. It was an existential struggle of annihilation, and the killing was fueled by cultural and racial odium in which no quarter was asked and no quarter was given. Few battles were more visceral or manifested in starker terms the fanatical nature of the Japanese resistance and their ideological hatred of Americans, which bewildered soldiers, Marines, and sailors alike. Image of Iwo Jima, you can see it's marked by 3 airfields. The one in the middle is Airfield 2. You can barely see the one at the bottom near Mount Suribachi, and the third one is in the highlands there in the north. You can barely see that it was actually under construction or so. 3 island chains stretched for 750 miles south of Tokyo, and in that entire 750 miles worth of island chains, only one island, Iwo Jima, was suitable for assault in airfields that could operate B-29s. There's literally nothing between the Marianas, where the B-29s were based, and Japan, other than the Bonin Islands and the Volcano Islands, which made up 2 of the 3 islands there. And then you could see what the Marines had to deal with. 16 miles of tunnels, 1,500 caverns, and 750 blockhouses were built in 7 months. The Japanese recognized early on the strategic significance of Iwo Jima and sent one of their top generals, Kiribayashi, who brought in mining engineers to start tunneling and building fortifications. His headquarters was actually 5 or 7, I think it was 7 levels, including hospitals and so forth. And he was about 80. His command post was about 80 feet underground. The volcanic rock was easy to tunnel, and when mixed, made for more impervious concrete. He was unusual in that he eschewed the offensive-minded Bushido code, and he stipulated no bonsai charges. And he ended up having to push hard against many of his officers who wanted a more offensive spirit. Kiribayashi assumed that he would be defeated, unlike Japanese generals in previous battles. So instead of the traditional approach of defending territory to attempt to win, his goal was to incur the maximum amount of American casualties. So instead of the traditional approach of repelling the landings, he established more defensible positions in the rugged interior, particularly in the northern part of the island, as well as Mount Suribachi. While there were some indications at Peleliu that the Japanese were shifting to a more defensible positions, the Marines largely missed these shifts, which is understandable because most of the construction was actually underground. I'll speak to that a little bit, and Doug will speak to it even more a little later. So here is a photograph of B-24s bombing. I think that's Airfield 1. In this slide here, I'll address the first question, and that is what changed. So in August, General Macarthur in August 1944, General Macarthur convinces President Roosevelt to invade Luzon before invading Formosa and the Chinese city of Amoy. Luzon was in his AOR, while Formosa was in Nimitz's AOR. In September 1944, Spruance convinces King and Nimitz to switch from the Formosa-China axis to the Iwo Jima-Okinawa axis. Spruance wanted Okinawa to anchor the blockade of Japan, which was only 330 miles from Japan. To do that required taking Iwo Jima. The costs, however, of seizing Formosa were thought to be prohibitive. In return for Nimitz's support of MacArthur's invasion of Luzon, which included Halsey's Third Fleet carrier task forces, the Army would support Okinawa, but couldn't support Iwo Jima, which became a Marine show. So Iwo Jima was really sandwiched between two larger operations, Luzon, which had 38,000 casualties, and Okinawa with 50,000 casualties, and suffered in many ways because of that. One of the reasons why Iwo Jima was assaulted was to ensure that we had unremitting pressure upon the Japanese. That is, we just couldn't. The Navy leaders thought we just couldn't take a break between Luzon and Okinawa, that we had to have something in there to maintain that pressure upon the Japanese logistics system, the Japanese offensive weapons, and so forth. So these schedules were really tight. They were very well planned out, and they had to be because you had to deconflict limited assets, as we will see, which included battleships and cruisers. Luzon was postponed to 7 January, which postponed Iwo Jima to 19 February, giving Kiribayashi another month to prepare for the assault. For its part, Okinawa was shifted to 1 April. Spruance's initial tasking for what was known as Operation Detachment were threefold. First, reduce Japan's naval and air strength and production facilities in Japan via carrier airstrikes. Second, destroy the enemy's naval and air strength in the Bonin Islands and the Volcano Islands. Third, occupy, defend Iwo Jima, and build air bases. In other words, the assaults of Iwo Jima was really one element in a wider ranging operation. Specifically, four general reasons were given of why Iwo Jima needed to be assaulted. And a lot of the contention comes from the whether or not these reasons actually panned out. The first one was to eliminate Iwo Jima as the early warning site and a base for Japanese fighters tasked to engage B-29s, and a base for Japanese bombers striking the B-29 bases in the Marianas and striking the carrier task forces as well. And that largely succeeded, although the Japanese had other early warning sites that gave warning of approaching B-29s, for example. But the Japanese used Iwo Jima a lot during earlier campaigns to shuttle particularly fighters all around the AOR. The second reason was to establish a base for tactical air cover to cover the carriers when they started moving in within range of Japanese-based aircraft to strike Japan, as well as support Okinawa operations to a lesser extent, and later on to support offensive operations for the blockade. Third, establish a base for American fighters to escort B-29s. That didn't pan out either, as Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the 20th Air Force, shifted the B-29s to nighttime incendiary raids starting in March 1945. So there was no need to escort B-29s. And by that time, the Japanese were not launching their fighters to conserve fuel. And finally, the fourth reason was to establish an emergency base and a refueling point, an emergency refueling point for B-29s. Now, B-29s could go from the Marianas to Tokyo, for example, without stopping. B-24s couldn't, though. So that's why the B-29s were the main strategic bombing asset in the latter part of the war. So in November, the Marianas-based B-29s began daylight precision bombings, which proved ineffective due to high winds, prompting the Navy to start planning carrier strikes on air bases and aircraft production facilities in Japan. Now, at the end of October is when the kamikazes first appeared at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October, I think 23, 24 or so, and they were clearly an eye-opener. And it only got worse during the invasion of Mindoro and later on Luzon as well. So in December 1944, the longest, most intensive bombardment of any Pacific island during the war starts. And what they found out after the war was the B-24s were bombing Iwo Jima 20 times a month. It was scheduled. And there was also carrier strikes. There was also bombardment from the surface ships. What they found out after the war is that really drove the Japanese efforts more underground and actually, in the end, made things worse. So Spruance wanted to ensure surprise by simultaneously invading Iwo Jima and making strikes upon the Tokyo air bases or so. But when you do, I think it's how many... 74 continuous days of bombardment. I think by that time the Japanese realized they were being earmarked for invasion. So now the Marines started getting worried in October, and they really started getting worried in January when photos revealed that Japanese construction was actually increasing despite the bombings, prompting the Marines to again request 10 days of pre-invasion bombardment. And it went all the way up to Turner and all the way up to Spruance. And they authorized only 3. And there were the various reasons for that. One was there wasn't enough ammo to actually support the landings of the first day. That 2 of the battleships, which were new, and so they had a phenomenal anti-aircraft capabilities, had to accompany the 16 carriers to do the 3 days worth of strikes in around Tokyo at the same time of the invasion, and some other issues as well. So here is the battleship New York pounding Iwo Jima. The 3-day bombardment commences. The first day was largely a bust because of weather, and the next 2 days focused on the beaches and not necessarily in the interior. Now, as the Marines will argue, the Navy argued, for example, that, hey, you had the aerial bombardment, and these 3 days, we were going to fire more shells than we would have if we had 10 days of bombardment. And the Marines say, well, that's not actually how it works. It works well over a longer period because you have to identify targets, you strike targets, particularly at Iwo Jima when you launch a shell and it exposes a lot more pillboxes and so forth as well. So the Navy was able to field 7 battleships and 7 cruisers for the bombardment. 6 to 8 battleships were unavailable. They had been earmarked for Iwo Jima, but Macarthur asked to keep them on station off of Luzon during the invasion. They went on for another 2 months or so. And like I said, 2 of the newer battleships accompanied the carriers to strike the 5,000 aircraft being hoarded around the Tokyo area. A lot of the controversy is whether more days of bombardment would have helped. Some argue not. The Japanese were dug in deep. The volcanic sand dissipated kinetic energy, and the Marines may very well have focused on the landing areas, which is not where the bulk of the defenses were. They were in mainly in the north in Suribachi, and particularly in north where you had intertwining systems. So if you attack one pillbox, you would get shot at behind you from another pillbox across the field, for example. So here are the dozen LCIGs, the landing craft infantry gunboats, moving in on the fateful morning of 17 February, which Director Cox will speak to. So the LCIs have now turned from paralleling the beach, and now they're heading right towards the beach. And you can see 3 of them right here, manned by 190 officers and sailors in general, 160 feet long. Within about 10 minutes of this photograph, are surprised by the immense amount of shells heading their way. The Japanese had thought that when they released the rockets to cover the UDT divers' survey of the beaches, that the invasion actually kicked off. And that was really the only Japanese error of the entire war, because it exposed a lot of positions of the Japanese gun positions. And they had massive amount of guns, 320 millimeter mortars, 12-inch naval cannon. It was pretty impressive. Here are the Marines, three Marine divisions, 3, 4, and 5. The largest Marine landing to date. 450 plus U.S. ships and vessels. You can probably count even more, up to 600. But it was immense. I can hardly imagine being a Marine on these landing craft, flat bottom boats, and watching as you approach the island, which was under a massive bombardment. Here are the 5th Division Marines on the beach under extraordinary fire. As you can probably tell by the photo there, the volcanic sand makes it really difficult to run on or dig a foxhole. If you dig a foxhole, it just collapses upon themselves. So you can see how exposed the Marines were right there. And reporters coming off the beach said they never saw so many broken up, destroyed human bodies. And one of the reasons for that is like I said, the volcanic sand dissipates energy when they land. So when it does hit Marines, for example, it's pretty bad. Although they all look alike, in this frame you can see several Navy corpsmen, a Navy doctor, and in the middle right there is a Navy chaplain looking at a Marine who was burnt. And this is, I think, on the second or third day or so. Meanwhile, a couple of days later, the USS Saratoga, one of the night carriers, was moving in towards Iwo Jima to launch nighttime patrols over Iwo Jima and Chichijima, which is in the Bonin Islands. Iwo Jima is on the Volcano Islands. It was being escorted by 3 destroyers, and whose anti-aircraft capabilities weren't as obviously as great as cruisers and battleships. When it was attacked at dusk by 6 kamikazes, killing 123 and injuring 192. So kamikazes were pretty effective at Iwo Jima, although the number of kamikazes at Iwo Jima pales in comparison to Okinawa. Here's a frame from a movie film of the Bismarck Sea about ready to get hit by the second of 2 kamikazes. The first one hit on the starboard bow into the hangar bay. You can probably see a little bit of smoke there. And then the second kamikaze is the red circle there, and it's about ready to hit the escort carrier amidships. Over 30 kamikazes made the 2-legged journey from the Tokyo area. stopping in the Bonin Islands to refuel. 3 or 4 of them couldn't make it, which left the 28 there. Bismarck stays the last carrier sunk in the war, suffers 318 killed and 1/3 of her crew as casualties. And the director will speak more directly to both the Saratoga and the Bismarck Sea. After getting mauled by kamikazes during the Leyte Gulf and again off of Luzon, the number of fighters on the flight deck was increased from 54 to 73 to address the kamikaze threat. So now we can see the requirements for fleet defense with the kamikazes are now skyrocketing. Since Iwo Jima was outside the range of U.S. land-based aircraft, land-based tactical aircraft, the carriers had to provide not only for fleet defense, but air defense of the island and close air support of the Marines on the island as well. Here we can see Marines at work. The fundamental weapons of the Marines during Iwo Jima were flamethrowers, grenades, satchels, and later on bulldozers. And you can see how close the combat was. And even as the photographer is taking this picture, no doubt he's looking behind him because you never know where the Japanese will fire from. Their positions were well camouflaged and very well protected. It kind of reminds you of some of the German positions on D-Day, for example. So even during the battle, the first B-29 makes an emergency landing. By 6 March, U.S. Army Air Force fighters and namely P-51s start to arrive, and it takes them a couple weeks to pick up the slack in terms of combat air patrol over the island, as well as close air support. But they adapted fairly rapidly. Ensign Kennelly was part of several medical advancements, which Doug will speak about as well. Not necessarily the golden hour, but the system was set up back then to evacuate the injured as soon as possible. So here is, I think that's the 5th Marine Division Cemetery under construction. I'm not sure if you can make it out, but how utterly pockmarked the moonscape of Iwo Jima actually is there. It's a stinking, sulfurous, rotten egg smelling island. Here's a B-29 that crash landed at a time when the B-29's mission abort rate was 20%. Iwo Jima was key in limiting losses of these extraordinarily expensive strategic assets. Over the next month, there were 2,400 emergency landings by B-29s at Iwo Jima, a staggering number. During the math, some claim that because of that, over 20,000 lives were saved, which provides rationale, which seeks to kind of counterbalance the cost-benefit ratio of Iwo Jima. But in reality, it certainly wouldn't be 20,000 lives have saved. By the same token, having flown blue water operations with no land in sight, and you're out there in the middle of nowhere, having an island like Iwo Jima to escape to is a huge relief as well. So, having answered the more tactical question of why Iwo Jima, we're now going to move on to the more strategic question of why Iwo Jima in a broader sense. Like I said, this is one of my favorite strategists, a fellow Hoosier, Admiral Ray Spruance, a native of Indianapolis, Indiana. He went to Shortridge High School, which is a rival of my high school growing up. I was up north in Crosstown. 2 things to note: 2 tours at the Naval War College, both as a student as an instructor. So Ray Spruance was very familiar with running War Plan Orange exercises on the massive checkerboard floor at the War College. And you can probably understand why he was so enamored with his favorite flagship, the USS Indianapolis. And as Director Cox will note, there was such an affinity between the Indianapolis and Admiral Spruance is that Admiral Spruance relatives we're still attending the Indianapolis Survivor Association meetings in Indianapolis through the years. So in the next two slides, I'll address the second question, which is, was Spruance's decision to shift U.S. strategy by advocating to seize Iwo Jima and Okinawa instead of Formosa and the port city of Amoy in China, how sound was that? Well, I argue it was pretty sound in retrospect. So you can look on the chart. It's colorized. The orange at the top is essentially the war plan orange. That's Nimitz's campaign through the Central Pacific. And they could see its planned terminus was supposed to be Formosa and Amoy. The green is Macarthur's campaign heading north, whose terminus was the Philippines, and unknown after that. The purple line demarks their respective AORs. You can see Formosa is in Nimitz's and Luzon is in Macarthur's. The blue arrows are the B-29s. B-29s were actually operating out of China. That was logistically difficult. There was a plans to shift to open up B-29 operations in Luzon. That didn't pan out, mainly because the Marianas was able to take on all the B-29s as well. And the yellow marks the Japanese controlled land, which you can see stretches all the way up to Manchuria. So, as Colin Gray noted, Japan aspired to wage only a limited maritime war for the defensive purpose of securing an island-anchored oceanic perimeter behind which the continental campaign in China could be won. Japan's center of gravity was not, as its leaders believed, with her armies on the mainland, rather on the maritime approaches to the home islands through the Central Pacific. Of Japan's 51 divisions, 23 were in China, 13 were in Manchuria, and 5 were deployed at home on Formosa, Korea, and Indochina, leaving 11 divisions to fight the Americans on the islands. With the carrier task forces, Spruance and Halsey destroyed the Japanese hope that land-based air power operating from widely separated fortress islands would attract U.S. sea power. That didn't happen. But what Spruance was the first to grasp that the United States had too long focused on Japan's continent-based land power, which is reflected in the terminus points of Luzon and Formosa, and the plans to seize Chinese airfields and ports. He recognized that Japanese land power in the mainland or on Formosa or the islands outside of the home waters would not be relevant to the war's outcome. So having destroyed Japan's offensive carrier-based capabilities earlier at the Philippine Sea, Spruance anticipated that the now Guam-based submarines in Halsey's Third Fleet operating off Luzon and the South China Seas would sink merchant ships en masse, closing the slocks to the south, and that Japan would be cut off. In other words, he anticipated that the Luzon-Formosa-Amoy barrier approach would be overcome by events, would be OBE, and way too costly. So with the Iwo Jima-Okinawa axis, Spruance relocated the locus of U.S. operations offshore and away from continental entanglements and closer to Japan. So relocating to Okinawa enabled better coordination between the U.S. three routes to victory: the blockade, strategic bombing, and invasion, and logistical support for them as well. This is a reminder the U.S. naval forces enabled all three of these routes. Sea power was, or projected, the force that defeated Japan. Relocating U.S. operations provided the maneuver room to leverage the mobility and flexibility of the carrier task forces to ensure surprise and reduce the threats from continent-based kamikazes. It is hard to calculate the number of U.S. lives saved by not having to defend against multiple axes of attacks from well-camouflaged continent-based kamikazes while operating in the inland waters of the East China Sea, for example. Off Okinawa, the kamikazes were wreaking havoc to the extent that Admiral King ordered to cut off logistical support to the B-29s if Curtis LeMay didn't follow Nimitz's orders to employ B-29s to strike their bases. So looking at this chart, one can understand, particularly in terms of MacArthur's more land-based route, particularly during the Battle of Guadalcanal, when the Navy lacked for carriers and the surface fleet had to fill in as the Navy's offensive arm, how devastating kamikazes would have been if employed earlier during the war. It would have really fundamentally altered U.S. strategy in the Pacific, given the losses. And you can see here the losses at Okinawa. 5,000 Navy deaths, almost the same with the Army, and 3,000 Marine, 1,900 kamikazes, 57 Allied ships sunk. Raids of 700 kamikazes and bomber aircraft were not uncommon during Okinawa. So now Nimitz's statement that the only surprise of the campaign were the kamikazes essentially admitted to the institutional lack of a deeper cultural understanding, particularly when developing War Plan Orange. As the CNO's navigation plan noted, we also need a deeper understanding of how our rivals think, which of course starts with history. Thank you very much. I would now like to introduce my boss, Sam Cox, retired two-star admiral, the director of the Naval History and Heritage Command and curator for the Navy, and a storyteller par excellence. Admiral, over to you, sir.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor for me to be able to speak to you tonight. Iwo Jima, occupied a special place in my family, in that my dad's cousin was a Marine flamethrower operator who was awarded a posthumous Navy Cross on Iwo Jima. So, in the pantheon of numerous extremely heroic actions by the Marine Corps, the Battle of Iwo Jima rightly occupies a unique place. And it's entirely fitting that the memorial to the Marines overlooking Washington, D.C. Is a representation of probably the most iconic photograph of the entire war. And it can be seen from all over the Capitol, and deservedly so, because it represents courage and sacrifice of a level that should never be forgotten. That sacrifice includes 5,931 Marines who gave their lives on Iwo Jima, including over 500 in just the first few hours alone. But the uncommon valor, as Nimitz called it, uncommon valor was a common virtue, also included an additional 881 U.S. naval personnel who lost their lives as well. And all the common perception is, the Navy guys sitting on a battleship, behind lots of armor plate, shelling the beach while the Marines go ashore. The reality at Iwo Jima is that over 100 U.S. Navy personnel were dead before the first Marine even set foot on the island. And of the 27 Medals of Honor awarded during the campaign, the first one went to Lieutenant Junior Grade Rufus Herring, who was the skipper of LCI G449. And that vessel suffered 21 dead and 18 wounded while refusing to back down from providing cover for an underwater demolition beach team, and despite intense Japanese artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire. I'm just going to focus mostly on the LCI battle, which took place 2 days before the actual, main invasion. And it's important, I think, to note that the LCI battle was essentially conducted entirely, under the leadership of ensigns and Lieutenant JGs, almost all of them reserve officers, and their crews were predominantly very young sailors who volunteered, during the war. So this was a classic case of the U.S., citizen, Army being thrown into battle during the war. It was the Naval Academy guys and whatnot, and the professionals who held the line at great cost early in the war. But by this time, this is, mass mobilization of the United States and our manpower to do this. But on the morning of 17 February, the weather had improved and visibility was good, and minesweeping had been underway for a couple days by that point. And the heavy cruiser Pensacola was the primary covering platform at the time, and was shelling what they thought were Japanese positions, almost all of which were very well camouflaged, very well hidden. As Pete touched on, Lieutenant General Kuribayashi was probably the most effective Japanese Army commander that we encountered in the entire war. And his strategy, which is in keeping with the Japanese at the time, who viewed that the strategic center of gravity for the war by that point was the ability of the U.S. civilian population to withstand the extremely high casualties. So the whole point was to kill as many Americans as possible, regardless of the cost to the Japanese. Japanese had also learned a lot of lessons during the war, one of which is defending at the beach is a bad idea when you're getting shelled by 14 and 16-inch, guns. And at Iwo Jima, although Lieutenant General Kobayashi was in charge, there was a Navy unit there under a Rear Admiral. And the Japanese, their idea of joint operations was for the Army to do its thing and the Navy to do its thing. And the Rear Admiral insisted on fighting at the beach. And Kobayashi finally gave in and let him do it. So the beach fortifications were primarily manned by Japanese Navy, while the Army stayed back in the middle of the island. But nevertheless, on the morning of the 17th, 3 battleships, Idaho, Tennessee, and Nevada, came within 3,000 yards of the shoreline to blast the beaches. Shortly after that, the Japanese shore battery did find the range on Pensacola, hit her 6 times in quick succession with 4.7-inch, 6-inch shells, blasting her combat information center, setting the float plane on fire, puncturing the hull in several places, and killing 17 sailors and wounding 98. Pensacola withdrew, but only temporarily. She was back in the battle within a few minutes after that. At 10:25 on the 17th, the battleships and heavy cruisers were ordered to open the distance from the beach in order to clear the way for 4 underwater demolition teams to conduct a close-in reconnaissance of the planned landing beaches, which were on the south side of the island, with Mount Suribachi would be on the left, and the flat part of the island goes off in the center and to the higher ground to the right. But the UDT teams were taken in on what were called fast destroyer transports. These were mostly just after World War I vintage destroyers that had been converted into troop transports. They were still armed, but their principal weapon was speed. They were quite fast. And the Bull, Bates, Barr, and Blessman each had a UDT team embarked of about 15 personnel each, and they ran in close to shore, and they put their UDT guys in, and it was a kind of oversized rubber boat that took them in closer to the beach, and then started putting the teams in the water. The Japanese held their fire to this point, expecting there to be beach reconnaissance. 7 destroyers at that point then closed to 3,000 yards, providing covering fire, and then 7 LCIG gunboats, which were landing craft infantry that were extensively modified with 40 millimeter, 20 millimeter guns in order to provide covering fire for normally the main invasion force, but in this case to cover the UDT teams. As the LCIs got about 1,100, they closed within 1,500 yards of the beach, preparing to unleash 4.5-inch rockets. And the Japanese along the shore that I said were Navy mistook this as the main invasion. And they opened up with everything they had from the beachfront defenses. Japanese fire was actually very heavy, well aimed and affected. And the LCI gunboats just took it, in the shorts. Every one of those 7 was hit repeatedly, in some cases with shells as large as 6 inches. Increasing damage and mounting casualties. Despite that, the LCI gunboats refused to back down and continued to provide covering fire for the swimmers. But some of the Japanese guns were so well protected they could not be neutralized except by direct hits. Eventually, the damage to several of the LCI gunboats became so severe that they temporarily withdrew from the fight. to fight their fires and offload dead and wounded onto the fleet mine layer Terror, which served as an impromptu casualty evacuation point and repair ship. And that enabled most of the LCI gunboats to then go back into the fight. Additional LCI gunboats of Flotilla 3 under the command of Commander Malin Pafi embarked in the flagship LCI 627, then dashed in to replace those that had been temporarily forced out. And despite damage and casualties, LCI gunboats 409, 438, 441, and 471, despite suffering 60% of casualties. LCI 474 was so badly damaged that she had to be abandoned and was scuttled by gunfire from the destroyer CAPS later on. In all, 12 LCI gunboats took part in this brutal fight, standing in until all but one of the UDT swimmers were recovered by 1240. One of the recovered swimmers later died from his head wounds. During the battle, the skipper of the battleship Nevada, who had been ordered to withdraw, actually did to provide space for the LCIs to go in. Actually did a Nelsonian turned a blind eye to his orders. Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen had been ordered to withdraw, and he very famously put his spyglass to his bad eye and said, "I can't see the signal," and then proceeded to go forth and win the battle. But in this case, the skipper of the Nevada stayed close, and its fire was very effective. Once the Japanese had opened up and revealed where their positions were, the battleship Nevada and also destroyer Lci, which moved in close, which also took some hits from the Japanese, they were able to take out quite a few Japanese shore positions, which, had they still been effective on the actual day of the invasion, would have made that horror show even worse than it actually was. Of the 12 LCI gunboats that were damaged during the UDT operation, 51 crewmen were killed and 148 were wounded. One LCI was lost, 2 had to be towed away. All of the LCI gunboats were awarded Navy unit commendation, and the flotilla commander and 11 of the LCI gunboat skippers were awarded the Navy Cross. The 12th was awarded Medal of Honor, and that was Lieutenant Junior Grade Rufus Herring, U.S. Naval Reserve, who had only recently taken command. And just to give you a sense of what it was like, I'm just going to read the Medal of Honor certificate. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commander of LCIG 449, operating as a unit of LCIG Group 8 during the pre-invasion attack on Iwo Jima on 17 February 1945. Boldly closing the strongly fortified shores under the devastating fire of Japanese coastal defense guns, then Lieutenant Junior Grade Herring directed shattering barrages of 40 millimeter and 20 millimeter gunfire against hostile beaches until struck down by the enemy's savage counterfire, which blasted the 449's heavy guns and whipped her decks into sheets of flame. Regaining consciousness, despite profuse bleeding, he was again critically wounded when a Japanese mortar crashed into the conning station, instantly killing or fatally wounding most of the officers and leaving the ship wallowing without navigational control. Upon recovering a second time, Lieutenant Herring resolutely climbed down to the pilot house and, fighting his own rapidly waning strength, took over the helm, established communications with the engine room, and carried on valiantly until relief could be obtained. When no longer able to stand, he propped himself against empty shell cases and rallied his men to the aid of the wounded. He maintained position in the firing line with his 20 millimeter guns in action in the face of sustained enemy fire and conned his crippled ship to safety. His unwavering fortitude, aggressive perseverance, and indomitable spirit against terrific odds reflect the highest credit upon Lieutenant Herring and uphold the highest traditions of the United States Navy service. There was a second UDT reconnaissance planned for that afternoon on the northwest side of the island. And by this point, none of the LCI gunboats were battle worthy. So the U.S. forces adapted, and battleships Tennessee, Arkansas, Texas, and a heavy cruiser provided cover for that UDT mission. That time, the Japanese kept their heads down. I'm mindful of the time here, so I'll touch upon a couple other things that I think were particularly of interest. Many of the casualties, as Pete mentioned, were Navy corpsmen. 4 of them were awarded the Medal of Honor, 2 of them posthumously. The main battle, the main invasion, started off with, exceptionally bad omen when the skipper of VC-77 off the escort carrier Rudyard Bay was conducting a pre-landing strike with a Marine observer in the back. He was flying an Avenger torpedo bomber being used as a bomber. It took a hit and exploded in midair, plainly visible to, every ship on the gun line and thousands of Marines, heading ashore. So it was taken as that this is going to be, that's a bad omen, and it certainly was. The Japanese were smart enough to wait until the beaches were packed with Marines as they discovered that the sand was so bad that you couldn't dig in, you couldn't move, you couldn't run, and that's when the main Japanese defenses, opened up. The Japanese responded to the Iwo Jima landings with an audacious air operation of their own. I forgot to mention on the first day, a Japanese fighter bomber, no one is quite sure where it came from. I think it was hidden on Iwo Jima, actually got airborne and planted a bomb on the fast transport Blessman on the first day of the battle. And that bomb killed 40 people, 40 crewmen on board the ship, including 15 of the UDT team that was on board, which was actually the highest loss of life for UDT in a single incident during the entire war. And between the LCIs and the Pensacola and the Blessman's casualties, that's how you get to 100 Navy dead, plus some aviators who were shot down. That's how you get to 100 Navy dead before the main battle even started. But once it was underway, the Japanese responded to the Iwo Jima landings with, audacious air operations of their own, and about 28 aircraft launched on a 600-mile one-way special attack mission, timed to hit U.S. ships right at dusk on 21 February. And with a matter of 3 minutes, 6 Japanese aircraft clobbered the aircraft carrier Saratoga with multiple bomb hits and aircraft hits, followed sometime by yet another kamikaze strike, all of which killed 123 sailors and wounded 192, and put that carrier out of action for basically the rest of the war. When she was repaired, she just served as a training carrier. Other Japanese aircraft went after the escort carrier Lunga Point, which miraculously survived. Torpedoes passed a few feet in front, few feet astern, and then one flaming kamikaze actually hit her flight deck, but grazed it in a way that it caused basically little damage. Her sister ship, the Bismarck C, was not as lucky and was hit in quick succession by 2 kamikazes, which ignited an inferno and explosions, sent her to the bottom with heavy loss of life, 318 sailors. And as Pete mentioned, Bismarck C was the last carrier lost, although others would come dangerously close in the months ahead. I shall also note that the Japanese also attempted to attack Iwo Jima with submarines. This was an abysmal failure because the U.S. ASW technology had advanced so much to include sonobuoys and phyto acoustic homing torpedoes. Of the 3 Japanese submarines carrying 5 K-10 manned suicide torpedoes each, Two were sunk with their entire crews along with the Cadens, and one barely escaped without launching her Cadens, and one submarine conducting a conventional mission was lost with all hands. There were numerous hard lessons learned. I think Pete covered that really well. And the battle over whether, Iwo Jima was worth it, that started before it was even over. Correspondents, ashore on the first day, seeing this, unbelievable carnage, which was described as a nightmare in hell, which was probably about as accurate description as anyone could do. But it also made very, very clear to U.S. High Command that the invasion of Okinawa and certainly any invasion of Japan was going to be incredibly costly. And so, all of those folks who go, well, you really didn't need to drop the atomic bombs and that was immoral and blah, blah, blah. Those folks have absolutely no understanding of what happened at Iwo Jima, happened at Okinawa, and the kamikaze attacks at Okinawa after. As horrible as they were, those bombs, there's millions of people who are alive today because those bombs were used, hopefully never again. And I think Pete, hit it about right on the, how many bomber pilots were really saved. Most of those planes landed as a precaution because it was there. It was a smart thing to do, but they probably would have made it back to Saipan. So, I'm in the camp that, was Iwo Jima worth it? The answer, no. But that's 2020 hindsight. The commanders at the time, Pete went through the reasons why they did it. You can only do with with what you know. And my view is that the commanders made the right decision, did the right thing based on the information that they had. And it's easy for us to sit back years later and go, yeah, well, we could have skipped that part. But nevertheless, that doesn't take anything away from the courage and valor of the Marines and the Navy who did their duty to the utmost on that hellish island. So with that, let me turn it over to Doug Kleinsmith, who's going to provide more detail on the naval gunfire aspect of the battle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Admiral. And my pleasure being here. Thank you very much for this opportunity to give this discussion. I don't need any slides and I didn't prepare any. What I do have is a number of show and tell items that I'll be using along the way here. Incidentally, coinciding with the great story that the Admiral told about the LCI, over my right shoulder is the uniform of my grandfather, who was a machinist mate on LCI 799, though not at Iwo Jima. He served in the Pacific through the years 44 to 45. My talk today is going to focus on naval gunfire, the naval gunfire support at Iwo Jima, but also the innovations and improvements made by naval gunfire over the course of the war that ultimately culminated at Iwo Jima. And I want to start out with my first show and tell item. And this is it right here. And I know Captain Rinn's looking at this and says, oh my God, he said naval gunfire and now he's got a rifle in his hands. But there's a number of things as a segue to this weapon, other than that it's a way cool weapon and I have one, is that this was the primary Marine weapon through most of the war, and in particular on Iwo Jima. And the Marine Corps has a philosophy that all Marines are riflemen, and everybody is there to support that rifleman, whether you're a tanker, you're an aviator, you're a supply, take your pick. And it's to support the rifleman's mission of seizing ground, closing with, and destroying the enemy. And that includes the use of naval gunfire. This weapon also is the embodiment of just American innovation and improvement that you saw in many, many aspects of equipment and tactics and techniques that the Americans came up with in World War II. This weapon, this rifle, was far superior than any other nation's rifle in that entire war. And it in particularly was because it held an internal 8-round clip that could be fired semi-automatically. And what do I mean by that? This is what I mean. Here I have a German Kar 98. And this is similar to every other nation that fought in the war, including Japan, a bolt-action weapon, which means that you had to manually load every round before you could fire it. The M1 Garand was semi-automatic with an internal clip of 8 rounds, and this is the ammunition pouches they would be using, and this is what the rounds would look like. And this innovation, in addition to it being a rugged, solid weapon, vastly increased the firepower of that weapon for the individual rifleman. And I point that out because while there are innovation and improvements in just simple things like the rifle, there are also innovations and improvement in the use of naval gunfire for ground support. And these were learned over a course of several campaigns during the war. First, at Guadalcanal, you saw the first use of overhead fires in conjunction with coordination with maneuver forces ashore. At Tarawa, you saw the use of naval gunfires very in close fire support to eliminate the beach defenses. And then lastly, at Saipan, it became obvious that continuous naval gunfire support was critical throughout the course of any battle. From these lessons, naval gunfire support, innovations and improvements were made in 3 areas along the lines of doctrine, training, and force structure. All of these would culminate, as I said, at Iwo Jima. First, in the area of naval gunfire doctrine. The old school doctrine when engaging shore defenses were for the Navy was ship survival, obviously. Ship survival was paramount. In order to increase ship survivability, you want to use the max extent range as possible, and you want to use your mobility or speed, thereby lowering the chance of counterfire. This, and the other aspect of was that they were after neutralization of targets. Neutralization in the textbook definition is 10% of the enemy destroyed, which renders that target neutral for a period of time, allowing action to be taken against it or forces to maneuver around it. That changed in the Pacific, mainly because of the Japanese and their philosophy of defense, but also in terms of this is what had to be done to get the Marines to their objectives. And it turned from a neutralization mission to a destruction mission. Destruction meaning 30% of the target or more, rendering it out of action for the entire engagement. But in order to get destructive fires, the Navy had to change their techniques. They had to move in closer to the shoreline, and they had to go slower in speed, and they had to use deliberate fire. These they adopted to great effect, starting with Tarawa and moving forward all the way to Iwo Jima. The second thing that came along here was training. The Naval Gun, in conjunction with the Marines, they established a Naval Gunfire School on the island of Kaho'olawe. I know somebody's going to be texting me on that one for sure. But in any event, this school emphasized not only ship gunnery, but also ship-to-shore communication with maneuver forces. Every ship was sent through there, and they were rehearsed and practiced extensively in order to get proficiency in accuracy as well as communications with the ground forces. And in conjunction with that, the Marine Corps changed their force structure in cooperation with the Navy. Shorefire control control parties were pushed all the way down to the battalion level, and they were led by Navy ensigns or lieutenant junior grades, with Marine officers providing the actual spotting of the naval gunfire rounds. Additionally, they established naval gunfire liaison teams at the battalion, the regiment, division, and even further, call it the corps level, with Navy personnel. They also stood up the one and only aerial observation squadron specifically designed to observe, adjust, and call in naval gunfire. This is VOF-1, and all this would come together, as I said, at the Battle of Iwo Jima. At Iwo Jima, what I'm going to want to cover here are three aspects: the prep fires, getting off the beach, and sustainment ashore. As both Dr. Haynes and the Admiral alluded to, the Japanese commander, Kiriabashi, his philosophy of defense was a defense in depth. And this defense in depth really started bearing fruit at the Battle of Peleliu. Unfortunately for him, he was at odds, as the Admiral alluded to, with the Navy commander. Imagine that, Army and Navy not coming together and agreeing with each other. The Navy commander wanted to defeat the invasion at the beach. And the only way he was going to be able to do that was to construct emplacements and revetments and bunkers along the way there to cover the one and only area that the Marines could possibly land. The problem for the Army commander was the Navy really owned the assets to not only do what he wanted to do, but what the Navy wanted to do. So in order to get the assets to dig those tunnels, pour concrete, do what he needed to do, he bargained with them and came with like a 50-50 split, because the Army sure wasn't shipping any of that material for him over there to him. It was all the Navy. So consequently, the naval commander built an extensive above ground defense, and Kiriabashi built an extensive underground defense. Now, we already talked about the number of days that the Marine Corps came up with for prep fires. And they came up with 10 days. And you're wondering, 10 days? How did they come up with that? Well, they actually had a formula based on naval gunfire use throughout the war. And what they did was they actually divided the island into 100-yard squares. And based on the reconnaissance, and they had extensive reconnaissance and both surface and aerial, and they knew every inch of that ground. And consequently, they could see the construction going on, and they saw what was above ground, and they had a very good idea what was going on below ground. But within this formula, what they would do is they'd take a 100-yard area, and they say, okay, so there's one revetment there, and one foxhole, and one bunker. Well, according to our table, it's going to take X amount of 5-inch, X amount of 8-inch, or X amount of 16-inch to destroy or at least neutralize in that 100-yard area. So when you start dividing that whole island out and you see all the number of things that they had to go after, that's where they came up with 10 days. And when they presented this to the Navy, the Navy was like, you got to be kidding me. First of all, we can't even haul that much ammo. And keep in mind, the closest resupply base was 600 miles away in the Saipan, Guam area. And secondly, they were very, very concerned, as both Dr. Haynes and the Admiral pointed out, with exposing the fleet to not only surface or aerial kamikaze attack, but also subsurface attack as well within that 10-day period where they had us coming close to shore to achieve this effects. So that's where the compromise came down to 3 days. And since it was going to be 3 days, the focus was going to be on the beach area. And one of the things that they went after were two very prominent emplacements, both housing huge guns that were overlooking the beach, one on one side of the beach, one on the other side of the beach. And they dedicated 2 battleships to that. And I don't know if you've ever seen 16-inch in action. And the time that I called it in way back when, 30 years ago almost to this day, it's an impressive ordnance. It is a highly impressive ordnance. This is coming from an artillery guy that has called in everything from 60 mortars to 8-inch. And as an Anglican guy who was a forward air controller, I've called in everything from 5-inch Zunis all the way to 1,000-pound general purpose bombs. When I called in the 16-inch, that was to this day, it burns in my mind what I saw. And what I saw was when I called it in, first of all, the battleship, I was hesitant. I said, okay, give me secondary ordnance. Let's start out with 5-inch to see where it goes. Now, I was with an Arab force, and we were heading up the coast of Kuwait, and they were stuck at a dug-in area ahead of them. So I said, hey, I got the battleship right here. Let's test it out. And when they said, oh, no, we're too far offshore, we're going to use main gun. As soon as they said that, the whole theater kind of stopped and held their breath. They fired the first round, and I'm waiting, and I'm waiting, and I'm waiting, and I'm waiting. And a lot of things go through your head when you're waiting that long. It was a 43-second time of flight. And believe me, a lot of scenarios went through my head like, did I call this wrong? Did I get the wrong grid coordinates? And then they gave me a splash, which is supposed to be 5 seconds before it hits. And I'm waiting, and I'm waiting, and I'm waiting. I literally went forward to grab the headset and say, I lost it when that thing went off. And these are old school gunnery techniques. These were not GPS coordinates. These were not computerized fire control systems. These were the old charts and darts and protractors that they were using to fire these naval guns. And that round went exactly where I called it, exactly. And it could have gone off in East Africa. I would have seen it. The plume on that was easily 10 stories high. The point of this story is when these things started engaging these above ground emplacements, and these emplacements were 5 feet of cement with rebarb and then sand put around it. And the Japanese thought, oh, they're never going to get through all this. The Navy used their 16-inch in what was called pointer fire, where it was just a single gun, and they would fire one round at it, and then another round at it, and then another round at it. The first round would clear the sand away. The next round would start eating away at it, and within, I think, a dozen rounds on each of these revetments, they had leveled them. And the inhabitants inside the Japanese tried to flee, and they were gunned down by other boats around there. Point being is the prep fires that they had for those 3 days proved very effective, because it's my belief that they would have launched more fire even as they were coming to the beach, rather than what was happening when the fires came. Most of the fires came after they hit the beach. And I think the reason why most of the fires came after the beach is you saw a transition between the naval philosophy of beating them in the water or at the beach that was neutralized in large part by naval gunfire, and the transition to Kiribati's strategy of let's wait till they get to shore, and now we're going to pound it, which led to the second piece, getting off the beach. And you saw a picture there that Dr. Haynes put up there of the Marines on the beach here. And what I want to show you here are two things here. I know, and Captain Marine's holding his breath for a second here. So I want you to, I hope you can see this. And yeah, this is a Marine playing with sand, but you can see this sand here. Okay, this is an ordinary sand that you would see probably at any beach you would go to. In fact, this is very special sand because it actually came from the beaches of Normandy here. And I show you this for contrast, because what I have right here is, this is what was on Iwo Jima. Whoops, let me see here. This is sand, actual sand from Iwo Jima. And as you can see here, it's volcanic. It has no viscosity. And as Dr. Haynes alluded to, when you step in it, you're actually, if you're going uphill, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And if you try to dig a foxhole into it, the sand fills in faster than you can dig. And once you get to the bottom, you've hit solid core and can't go anywhere. So the Marines had to get off the beach. They had to get off the beach in a hurry. And one of the pre-planned ways of doing that was with naval gunfire. Naval gunfire they had planned to use as a rolling barrage as the various elements of the Marines advanced off the beach. And that rolling barrage is very similar to what you may have heard or read or seen about in World War I. Rolling barrages going before the infantry as they advanced across no man's land. It would hit the enemy in places, and if it was timed correctly, the barrage would roll off and the infantry would jump in and seize the trenches. Well, that's a difficult timing piece, very, very difficult timing piece. And many times that rolling barrage in World War I got away from the infantry. To counter that, they use VFO-1, the aerial observers. And they, when the Marines started to climb off that beach and start rolling forward, their rolling barrage was right in front of them. However, as with any assault, there's a number of things that could have slowed them down and did, not to include the enemy and the sand that I just showed you. So several times the area observers saw the rolling barrage getting away from the advancing Marines and readjusted using the aerial observation and communications back to the naval gunfire ships to reset that rolling barrage and ultimately get those Marines off the beach, in which they did, and moved inland and cut the neck off of Iwo Jima there. The last piece I want to focus on is the naval gunfire sustainment throughout the battle. And the Marines were really under no illusion of what they're about to come up against. They'd already seen it in Peleliu. And both the 4th and the 5th Marine Divisions trained extensively at Camp Pendleton to prepare for this. But as much as you can prepare for it, it was recognized it was going to be a hard slug any way you slice it. You have to picture a World War I environment where you cannot, since you're on an island and it's very restrictive, you're not going to be able to move around and gain advantage. You have to go forward. And when you engage one opening or one revetment or one bunker, you can be sure another bunker or hidden cave or hole was there to cover the front of that bunker. And the only way you could really do that is with a combination of fire support, the use of flamethrowers, the use of smoke, and naval gunfire, which came in critical as they moved across the island bit by bit. And they were able to do very close in naval gunfire support. And close in is like 200 yards. And that's, believe me, that's close. And they were only be able to do that because of the training and because of the shore fire control parties. They were able to push down to the battalion, to the company, and even down to the platoon level as they push forward across that island. The other piece of naval gunfire that there's two pieces that don't get much attention that I want to illustrate here. One was the incessant pounding that the island took. And when you're underground for what ended up being weeks in a sulfuric atmosphere, the incessant pounding, the never stop reverberation of a 16-inch, 14-inch, even a 5-inch had to have played a psychological effect, a deteriorating psychological effect against the enemy as they moved across the island. And then one other piece that really doesn't get much press on at all is the importance naval gunfire played during the night. And the night was the enemy's to the enemy's advantage, to the Japanese in particular. And what we saw through the course of the war was the Japanese did two things. One, they would launch banzai attacks in the middle of the night and or infiltration assaults. Infiltration assaults were more deadly than the banzai assaults. And what an infiltration assault, and the Marines feared this a lot more than the banzai attacks. The infiltration assaults were onesies and twosies, creeping through the night, using the cover of darkness, right to the point that you could get to a Marine foxhole and jump in with them and knife them. That scared them more than banzai charges. So how do you counter those? Both of those. Nighttime, what the Navy did was they made nighttime daytime, and they shot illumination through every night that the battle occurred. Somewhere up to 1,000 illumination rounds every day. And by turning the night into day, The Marines, one, could really rest a little easier at night. They could spot the bonsai charges from way out, and they could also pick up on the infiltrators easier than if it was just pitch dark out there. And that's what the Navy did throughout the course of that campaign there. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that Naval Gunfire supported the Naval Gunfire ground support, the improvements and innovations through doctrine, training, and force structure, culminating at Iwo Jima, ultimately proved critically important to the successes achieved by the Marine riflemen in that battle. And that's my conclusion. Thanks for listening.
Hey, can I jump in with something I forgot? It's like I got my own show and tell here. This is a standard issue Japanese infantry rifle, which still has the Imperial crest not filed off, which means it wasn't surrendered. It was captured in battle by my grandfather from a Japanese sniper on Guam. And my grandfather was a Seabee. And I just want to note that at Iwo Jima, Seabees went ashore in the second wave. And during the battle, the 133rd CB Battalion suffered the highest casualties of any CB unit in the entire war, with 45 dead or missing and over 275 wounded. So the CBs and the medics and the Beachmasters, they were right in the thick of it from the very beginning. So that's all I got.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to all the presenters. It was really great. Doug, that was really remarkable. And when you picked up that Garand, I was worried that it was armed. I want to express my thanks to Dr. Haynes, Admiral Cox, and Colonel Kleinsmith for a tremendously informative presentation about the Battle of Iwo Jima that I think not only illuminated a lot of thoughts that people had, but also answered a lot of questions with some very good descriptions of what made the battle what it was. So thank you very much from SNA and for me personally for coming tonight and for doing the part that you did.